We have a panel of distinguished enough people here to talk to us today. My name's Steve Bolt. I'm not a politician, but everybody else here on the front panel is in fact a politician of some sort or other. Right next to me is someone that you will need no introduction, but we'll get one anyway. Senator Derryn Hinch, a long-standing commentator and troublemaker, and now on the public payroll, thanks to the wise voters of Victoria, who put him into the Senate. Next to him is,
actually, I'm not a politician.
Not a politician, in fact, but a distinguished visitor from sometimes sunny Canada. Robert, last name is?
Robert Laurie from
Laurie,
Vancouver,
of course,
Canada,
of course,
the
of
marijuana
course.
lawyer.
Sorry, Rob. The Rob part's easiest. That's last name that was difficult. And speaking of difficult surnames, David Leyonhjelm. I've been practicing, got it almost right, from, again, the Senator of New South Wales.
David.
The David was the easy part. David Leyonhjelm from the Liberal Democrats, Senator for New South Wales, and member of the upper house of the New South Wales Parliament. Next to him, David Shoebridge, representing the Greens Party. So politicians, current serving, and interested observer from sunny and sometimes snowy Canada in Rob, who is a lawyer and able to talk to us a little bit about what's happening recently in Canada. But the real question today for our panel, in the limited time we have, is should we have a Charter of Rights? Would that help? In terms of cannabis law reform, is it a useful thing? Is it a good thing? Should we have one anyway? And I'm simply going to ask each of our panellists to offer a few minutes of their observations, and then we'll pass it over to the general public assembled here today. MardiGrass is a participation thing, it's not an observation thing. We'll be having a rally later on at 2 o'clock, so hope everyone who's in the room today will be joining us to march in the rally and not just observe it. But part of that is also talking about things. If you've got questions or comments, that's what we hear about here today to hear about, so we'll get to that shortly. But I might just go down the panel in my customary way from the left-hand side, asking David, first of all, to make a few comments about his views about should we have a Charter of Rights, as in David Shoebridge. Thank you.
Well, the obvious answer, should we have a Charter of Rights? Yes. And I think all of us, I assume, I'm assuming, well, I'll wait for Derryn, but I think all of us are going to say, yes, we should have a Bill of Rights or a Charter of Rights. And you can see that in places like Canada, states in the US, that having a Bill of Rights has been an important legal tool, but it's also been, I think, an important way of framing the argument on cannabis law reform. In Australia, we have I'd say a very rudimentary sort of civil liberties public discussion. You almost never hear civil liberties arguments being persuasively argued by either Labor or the Coalition. They just don't buy into the civil liberties argument at either a state level or a federal level. And in fact, former Premier Bob Carr, if any of you remember Bob Carr, he was like the principal reason why there was a moment about 12 years ago when New South Wales could have had a Bill of Rights. And there was a push within parts of the Labor Party, the Greens, even elements in the Coalition. There was a chance there to get a Bill of Rights. And Bob Carr came out and started articulating an argument that was also being articulated from the far right of politics and from the Daily Telegraph, which says if you get a Bill of Rights, a bunch of unelected judges are going to start telling us how to behave, and you're going to disempower those poor politicians who are beautifully democratically elected. And that's been the argument that the status quo that the majority parties have used ever since. That if you get a Bill of Rights, you're going to replace politicians' power with judges' power. And I've got to say, that is a crock, that argument, a complete and utter crock. You actually see from those jurisdictions where there is a Bill of Rights, you actually see the courts moderating the excesses of the parliaments. Because in New South Wales, there's no Bill of Rights at all. No rights at all. Whatever rights we have in New South Wales, the Parliament of New South Wales gives you, and then they can take them off you the next day. We have some rudimentary common law rights, but they can literally just be written out of existence by legislation. When you're studying as a lawyer, and I'm still a barrister in New South Wales, but when you're studying as a lawyer, you're often given this test about the extent to which the New South Wales Parliament can just legislate away anything. And the case study that is used in a whole bunch of legal textbooks in Australia is, could a state parliament legislate to put to death all boys who are born with blue eyes? And I've got to tell you, there's a huge amount of argument in the legal fraternity about whether or not that would or would not be a valid law. A bunch of dry lawyers would say, actually, that would be a valid law. Commonwealth couldn't intervene. No one could intervene. You could just have it. Another bunch of lawyers say, well, maybe there's some sort of implied limit to what parliaments can do. But that shows you how few rights we have. And often you'll hear politicians start talking about US rights, you know, the right to bear arms, which isn't the right to wear singlets, by the way, or other rights such as that. We don't have those rights. I firmly believe if we're going to get somewhere on drug law reform, if we're going to get somewhere on cannabis, we actually need to bring it into a broader civil rights argument. And for me, a Bill of Rights and a Charter of Rights should make it very clear that we have the right to pretty much do what we like, provided it doesn't cause harm to others. And that's the key test. You should have the right to live your life, provided you're not out there causing harm to others. Now, I think we would probably have an argument amongst the panel about where that right ends. I don't believe in a right to firearms, unlimited firearms ownership. I don't believe in a right to be an intolerant, nasty, vindictive public speaker. I think exercising those rights harm others. But the basic right we should all be asking for and demanding is you have a right to do what you will, provided the exercise of that right doesn't cause harm to third parties. And top of that list would be the right to consume cannabis if you so choose.
Thank you, David. Another David Leyonhjelm. See, the harder I try, the harder it is. David, thank you.
Thank you. I don't have a problem, similar to David, I don't have a problem with the theory of Bill of Rights or Charter of Rights. The trouble I have with it is whether or not it would actually change anything if we had one. And if I was dictator for the day and could appoint all the Supreme Court judges, it would be an extremely good Bill of Rights and it would be very well enforced. But that neither of those is ever going to happen. And the practical reality is the Bill of Rights would end up being some sort of idea of what people thought rights were. Could be all sorts of things included in it and important rights that weren't in it. And it would be enforced by judges who don't necessarily share the views of the rest of us or my views or your views. And when you look around the world at countries that rank high on the Human Freedom Index, and Cato Institute, amongst others, in the United States does a regular assessment of every country in the world and ranks them according to their freedom. Freedom is, I'm a libertarian, the Liberal Democratic Party is libertarian, so we rank freedom particularly high. At the top of that list is Hong Kong, followed by Switzerland, then New Zealand, then Ireland, Denmark, Canada, the UK, Australia, Finland and the Netherlands. You notice the United States is not there. The United States has a very clear Bill of Rights with some significant rights entrenched in it. Now, if you then look at each of the countries that are in that list that I just read out, Hong Kong, well, it's now part of China, but it's still regarded as a very free country. It has entrenched the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights into its statutory law. That's as far as it goes. It's not a charter. Switzerland has incorporated the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights and the ICCPR into its statutory law. New Zealand just has a statutory law of a Charter of Rights. Can be overturned. Charters of Rights are only as good as the next Parliament. They're probably better to be there than not to be there, but they can't entrench them. Ireland, Denmark, Finland and Netherlands in that top 10 are members of the EU. The EU has adopted a charter of rights, but it's not constitutional, not entrenched, New Zealand has a statute law, as I said. Canada, I think, has an entrenched Bill of Rights in their constitution. Is that right? You'll explain, yeah. UK just has a statute law. Australia has nothing at all, and it's 8th on that list. Finland and the Netherlands, as I said, are after it. United States is well down the list. So the question then is, well, would Australia move up the list? Would Australia increase its rights with a Charter of Rights or an entrenched Bill of Rights in the Constitution? And would our High Court, in fact, uphold the values that we would regard as sufficiently important to put into a Charter of Rights and a Bill of Rights? Frankly, I don't think they would. When we look at countries which do have entrenched statutory Bill of Rights, South Africa and the United States are both up there. South Africa has a very clear Bill of Rights in its constitution, and it's not even in the top 50 in terms of free countries. So, and over the years, during the period of the Cold War, when the communist countries were pretending that, claiming that they had a better alternative to free enterprise economies, they all had bills of rights. They had wonderful sounding words in them, which were intended to protect their citizens from things like random arrest and ensure justice before the law, freedom of association, freedom of movement, those basic fundamental rights, and they had none of them. So, unfortunately, although it's good in theory, and I have no opposition to the theory, I think the practice doesn't substantiate that. I would much rather that we had a stronger civil society and a strong feeling within the community saying to politicians, don't mess with me, leave me alone, don't mess with me, get off my back, I don't need a law to protect me as long as you stay away from me.
Thank you, David.
I'll swap here. Hello. It's a pleasure to be in Australia. I spent a lot of time, living in Europe and studying at Oxford. After the Americans and the Germans, the next biggest group was the Australians and the New Zealanders. So I do feel that before I actually came to Australia, I had a good idea of Australia. And my opinion of Australia more or less remained the same. I see you guys as Canada, the South Pacific, and Canada, at least the West Coast, is Australia of the North. And in fact, it is this common crossover and the ideals of civil liberties, fundamental freedoms, human rights. I mean, like Canada being a colony of the Great British Empire, we were certainly sent off to fight wars and promote freedoms and liberties of the Crown. And Canada, like Australia, at the turn of the last century, started to realize, hey, if we're doing all this work for king and country, what's in it for us? And well, this led to essentially realizing the defects of a Bill of Rights. Canada still has a Bill of Rights, but it really is a bit of a toothless tiger because it is entrenched legislation. That means it's subject to the will of the next parliament that comes in. So Pierre Elliott Trudeau, he is the father of our current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, due to really the failure of a Bill of Rights, pushed very hard for a Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And I won't get too into it, but I really believe that Canada would not be a leader in the, pushing and a front leader in human rights and human dignities had it not been for the Charter. Just a broad section of some of the issues that have been caught and overturned by the Charter included, you couldn't shop on Sundays back in, the 80s and so on, and that was overturned. Abortion, Henry Morgenthaler, that was a huge case. We've had then, the Rodriguez right to life and abortion. These are, I'm not going to say which way we fall on those issues in Canada, but the Charter has enabled us a safety blanket, if you will, to ensure that the values, whatever necessarily they may be for your country, but in Canada, they're usually, peace, good order, or peace, order, good government, so that we can facilitate trade and international commerce. That's essentially what Canada's mission statement at the UN is. But certainly at home, it's to be a leader and recognized as putting rules like fundamental justice, the rule of law, and good government at the foreground. And I truly, truly believe that that would not be possible without the protections of the Charter. And so I talked a little bit about this the other night and yesterday, but without the Charter, I don't think Canada would have had the medical marijuana foundations of the program that it has had it not been for the Charter. I'll just say one last bit within the context of medical cannabis. The first case that kicked off the whole Canadian medical marijuana program was Regina v. Parker. And Mr. Parker, Terry Parker, was a severe epileptic. And here he was faced in the position of, do I grow medicine that enables me to have a relatively productive life, or do I face criminal sanction and jail and poor health? Well, his criminal case for cultivation and production went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada, and they found that Mr. Parker's right to life, liberty, and the security of the person, which is Section 7 of the Charter, was infringed. And so the Supreme Court, not the executive or the legislature, said, well, clearly Mr. Parker, the Parliament didn't intend Mr. Parker to make the choice between his freedom or his medicine. Therefore, we put it to you, Government of Canada, that you have so many months, usually a year to 6 months, to come up with the new legislation. And so that's what's happened. We've had about 4 or 5 now incarnations of cannabis legislation designed with medical patients in mind. Now, it's not perfect, but if I was a lawyer representing or charged with representing any of you out there, I would be naked without the Charter, put it this way. So I do think that your state, your federal state, as well as your territories and it's not provinces, territories. Again, I think that's needed to adjust the balance as well as for municipal, because the Charter applies to all government decisions. So again, I think it's wonderful, and I'm really delighted to hear that you're having the conversation in Australia. And yeah, I definitely think look to Canada for a model, but make something that is your own, is my best advice. Thank you all for having us.
I just explained to Rob that my definition of a Canadian is a person who can't get a job in the United States. It also applies to New Zealanders who can't get a job in Australia, so there we are.
We seem to have the new capital of Australia, I think, is Whistler, given the number of Australians that are there on work visas. So.
Look, on this issue, I think we have to go back to 1999 to the referendum for a republic. And the question, of course, was manipulated by the government. What sort of republic do you want? Do you want the politicians' republic or not, or the people's republic? On this issue, on a Bill of Rights or a charter, you've got to decide what sort of Bill of Rights, what sort of charter do you want? I mean, do you have the, as David Leyonhjelm mentioned, it can be an entrenched Bill of Rights like the United States of America has got, which virtually is omnipotent, that cannot be tinkered with by successive governments. Otherwise, the Bill of Rights is just a bill. Like any other piece of legislation that comes before us in Canberra, it's just a bill, and it can be thrown out at the next election, after the next election, or be tinkered with, or changed, or bastardised. So I think that form of Bill of Rights is not worth the paper it's written on. I think you should be, if you're going to go for it, go the whole hog and go for an entrenched version of a Bill of Rights, because whether you've got Obama in the White House or you've got Trump in the White House, there's not much they can do. They can do a lot of damage, but not much they can do to the Bill of Rights, and that is why I think that system is a better one. You can argue, of course, that we're talking about the quality of judges. You can argue that under our Constitution, we have a system where when things go bad, that as your case of blue-eyed boys, I disagree with you that your state government could have done that, because somebody would have taken it to the High Court, and the High Court would have overruled it. Being blue-eyed, that's the argument that I'm putting forward. Anyway, so I support the idea of a Bill of Rights. Sorry? Maybe.
Depends on the judge, I would suspect. If it's a blue-eyed judge, he'd probably send it back to the lower court.
Yes. We'll give the Aryan solution. So I support the idea of a Bill of Rights. I do take up with Senator Leyonhjelm's argument, and it is a strong one from people who are opposed to it, say, well, just the name Bill of Rights, it will confirm some rights. for Indigenous Australians, for homosexuals, for women, but it may then inhibit or hurt the rights unintentionally of other people who think, hey, that right of mine's being taken away while you're getting this right there. So, look, I'm a bit pessimistic. I've said to some of you may have heard this yesterday. I wrote a column last week. And I am a bit pessimistic about Australia because I said, who would have thunk it? Who would have thought that backwater New Zealand and religiously rigid Ireland would have same-sex marriage for Australia? And who would have thought that several American states, even conservative ones, are selling commercialised, legalised marijuana decades before we have? So if I sound a bit disillusioned, that's the reason. Thank you.
Thank you. That's yours. Thank you, Derryn. And thank you to each of our other speakers. Food for thought, food for thought. We have a keen person, Kath, with the microphone. We'll hand it to you now. And if I could just ask people to use the microphone to make comments or ask questions. Whack your hand up and we'll see you. I'm sure we will.
Thanks.
Okay.
And my question goes to those who are in favour of the Charter of Rights. And just isn't it a little bit ask about for us to be going to the government and saying, please, Mr. Government, so what rights can we have, when we should, we know what rights we've got. Why shouldn't we just, take those rights and dare the government to come after us?
Well, that's very brave. But I'd warn you, people say Hinch is a man of his convictions. I just wish I didn't have so many. So you're entitled to do that. I mean, you're entitled. I know that the head of the ACT, you got into trouble talking about breaking bad laws. You're entitled to break the law, but the position there is that you can break the law, but take the consequences, know what you're doing. So yes, you're quite right, you can do it, but be prepared for going inside.
Yeah, that's the idea that you should just seize your rights. Yeah, I agree with Derryn to that extent. Go ahead if you think that a law is unlawful and you want to break the law and stare down the police. But I think you should be clear about it. In New South Wales, there are 16,000 police and there's one of you. The police are extremely well armed, highly organised, and have an entire state apparatus behind them. And my guess, most of the time, is the police will win. And that's why you need to change the law to actually give ordinary citizens some kind of power, to give them some kind of something to protect themselves. And that's what the Canadian experience is all about. Ordinary citizens being monstered by bad laws, have parliaments that aren't listening to them, but a Charter of Rights gives you something to grab hold of and actually fight back. And fight back in the courts, and ultimately, if we had one in Australia, fight back in the High Court and actually claim some of your own independence back. Now, that may not be the best way of obtaining all of your rights, but it's clearly a way of empowering citizens to be able to stand up in a principled way against an oppressive or ugly government. And, who would you rather, at the end of the day, is going to be assessing your final liberty? Tony Abbott with a coalition majority, or a judge in the High Court? Now, they may not be either of your perfect solutions, but most people would ordinarily feel they're going to have a fairer chance in defending their essential liberties if they're having an argument with the High Court than they are of having an argument with a coalition majority federal government. Of course, citizens' power, collective action is the way we will get a Bill of Rights and hold governments to account, but rights are a key part of it.
If I can add just to that, just to let you know, in the Canadian context, they're not, the rights are not absolute. There is Section 1 of the Charter which says that these freedoms are subject to limitations of a just and free democratic society. So what you're looking at is minimal intrusion. I mean, the state can still interfere with a right, but is it the most minimally intrusive method of interfering with that right? So essentially what you have is a compromise on both sides, and I think compromise is essentially how you can get the best of both sides, government getting policy and agenda, but at the same with citizens and an understanding of government can't just roll over us like a steamroller.
My understanding, you could probably correct me about Canada, is they can infringe your rights, but there has to be a legitimate purpose to it. They can't just do it in a bloody-minded way, and they look at the purpose as well.
Yeah, and it's, again, very purpose-driven, and we joke about law school or Canadian-made judgments. It's essentially always a three-part balancing test between the rights of the citizen and the, administrative prerogatives of the state in order to carry out the will of Parliament. So again, Canada, we sort of laugh as being the quiet neighbor to the north, but of all the countries that I've lived in Texas, I've lived in Ireland, I've lived in England, I'm Canadian. I think the Canadians really have got something there that the rest of the world should consider. And again, one of the other real big issues under our charter has been language rights. And that's something with Quebec that I think on the international scene gets glossed over a lot. But here, part of the reason that a charter came in was to protect language and the cultural rights of the Quebecois, the Quebec folk. So again, now we're seeing charter being used with also respect to our First Nation or Aboriginal communities. So the charter, I think, continues to define us as a Canadian, and having the right values entrenched in the charter, I believe, enables us as a nation to continue to build on our successes as well as guard against potential vulnerabilities and compromises to rights. So anyway, that was my 2 cents.
Question right at the back.
I just want to ask about whether or not there would be an option for a High Court challenge in Australia, because we're told that we can't use cannabis because it's dangerous and all this, but there was never any evidence of that. And it seems that the onus of proof has been reversed, that in a formal argument situation, if I said A, B, C, D, then the onus is on me to prove what I'm saying, not on the person who's actually questioning my position. And it seems like we've got the Australian government has taken a position without ever having to justify that, and now the community has to essentially prove that cannabis can raise people from the dead, and we have to be able to sort of prove that multiple times in the same experimental circumstances. But we're fighting a losing battle simply from that point of view, in that the onus of proof has been reversed. So could we take it to a High Court challenge and say we put the onus of proof back on the government to actually justify prohibition of cannabis, and if they can't, then that should be removed from our Narcotics Act. End of story. We're done. Everyone gets to do whatever they want with cannabis.
Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but in short, no. There is no relationship. There is no relationship between the law and facts.
Wait.
Unfortunately, there is no relationship between the law and facts. If facts drove the laws would be considerably different, including on cannabis. But you cannot go to a court and say this law is wrong and it should be thrown out because it is based on wrong facts. Even though there are plenty of laws like that, plenty. You cannot go to a court and say that. If to change the law, this is the reality of it, I'm not saying that this is an ideal situation. To change the law, you actually have to convince politicians the law should be changed, because that's how the laws are made. And making laws is a bit like making sausages. You really don't want to know the details of it. But if enough politicians are convinced the law should be changed, doesn't matter what the facts say, the politicians will change the law. If they're not convinced, they won't change the law. That's how it works.
Can hear. Can I just say this? The question was from the woman at the back, why am I still being arrested? Look, in a sense, that's what we're arguing about, in the sense of the argument about a Bill of Rights. If there was a Bill of Rights that said humans, Australian citizens, New South Wales citizens, for example, had the right to leisure or pleasure, for example, there'd be an argument that the use of cannabis is part of that right. Okay, for example, right? Depends how you word the bill. Depends all sorts of details. But that's the kind of thing that's our argument. Would it help if we had something like that that was part of Australian law or state law that the other laws had to be tested against. At the moment, they are not tested against. As David says, they can be the most stupid law, objectively speaking, but the constitutional power is there for the Parliament to pass laws. Courts have to follow it. Cops will do what they're told.
But if you had that, the Bill of Rights that had the American life and liberty, that gives you a broader way to go into the courts, as you had with the Canadian case that you told me, Mr. Carter, was it the
Parker,
Mr. Parker, and that's a classic example of why we should be having it here.
there's a lady, I think, in the front with a question.
Well, I'll wait for your question and then
I've only got limited time. I am the MardiGrass Queen from last year.
Yay!
I have no experience or even university background, but I would like to propose something for the Nimbin community, and that's a self-governed community, just like the gentleman in the middle was saying, as a potential, what would we call it,
Maybe a community charter?
a community charter that would require us to create our own laws within the community, that we would be different from outside, but there would also be a limit to our jurisdiction. It would be maybe somebody kilometres from the centre of Nimbin, and that we looked at how much funding we get overall. You know, we've got a lot of people who have, services, social services, etc. Look at our income stream from it, whatever it might be. We all honestly go, I get this amount. And then go, right, we'd like to take responsibility for that amount, and we want to see that every person who's currently not living well, possibly living in under shelter, children, etc., utilise that money to the best of their advantage. Now, this has actually happened as some sort of social experiment years back in America, and they did a year study, and there were children and families on the breadline who had only just getting by, and they said, you know what, we're going to take away that stress out of your life, and we're going to give you the money you need to survive. Now, those people didn't go and, yep, let's go and sit on the beach. They continued what their dreams were for their life ambition. They actually improved their status as individuals. They all worked. It all worked for them. And after the year, the government put a close to it. And only, I think, is anyone knowing what report I'm referring to?
No, I tell you one thing.
37...
I hate to put cold water on what you're saying, but Prince Leonard of Hutt actually tried that in Australia, and it won't work. We're overgoverned now with too many states, and if you're a federalist, you think we've got too many states. I'm afraid the governments would never let you, right? They would never let you. But
just the fact that we say the government would never let us. I've got the joy of homeschooling my kids at the moment, and one of the things we're doing is reading a book by an author called John Steinbeck, and I'm uneducated, so you tell me who he is, except we've listened to it because both my children are dyslexic, over 16 CDs, and he in the 20s was called a communist because he wrote this beautiful book called The Grapes of Wrath, that realised that a community on their own can self-govern, and those people can have access to fresh water, hot water. They can have something that looks like the CWA come and ask, what skills do you have? How can you include them into our community? What else? If anyone else knows the book, they can say, hey, we can be that community. We can be, they called it a government camp, but basically... Bring it on, sister, bring it on. I'm not the one to do it, but I know that we've got the capacity because I've come to this village 7 years ago, and I'm so impressed by every person that I meet, either by the struggle they experience or by what they hope to give to other people. So, I had a lovely opportunity to talk with Derryn Hinch last year, and he said, you came upon an idea, and my idea at the time was, I've got 3 boys, and I've got a good chance that one of those 3 boys is going to utilise marijuana. I don't know why, and they're going to take risks. I had 3 boys, and I'm a mother, and I'm thinking, how can I avoid that? And the first way is to legalise marijuana. But then I went further than that, and I went, wait, I've got a community that works here. I'm living in a community that has great skills. Why are they being... constantly, weekly, what's the word? When other people come upon you and this is what happens in the government camps in this book, in Grapes of Wrath, is that they're getting along, everything's fine, and they have the best dances on
We have
the
good
East
dancers here
Coast.
too.
And what happens? Yes. So
We're gonna
these
have to
great,
cut
let's
you.
call them dwarfs,
It's
get closed
terrific.
down, and
This
they
is really
actually
good,
even
but-
try to close them down
stuff,
and
but-
create issues around them, so that those people who are enjoying them can't actually enjoy the fruits of their labour. They don't have anything, and then they're told you can't have
Yeah,
that.
yeah. I've read the Grapes of Rocket.
And will you
It was
please
a song.
applaud,
Thank you,
also,
thank you.
you may not be aware, please applaud Sylvia, the ganja queen of last year.
But look, I don't
It's
know.
nice to have the
What we
revolutionaries
actually
here as
saw then was somebody actually standing up to whoever's in a position of authority and asserting your rights. And you did. You shut us all down and you asserted your rights, which was a perfectly wonderfully Nimbin thing to do. And that's kind of what MardiGrass is. I don't know if you're out there at 4:20 yesterday afternoon, but there are a couple of thousand people asserting their rights and basically saying to the New South Wales Police, come and arrest us. There's 30 of you. There's 3,500 of us. You're not going to be able to do it. And there was a huge amount of, self-assertive authority. And Nimbin, in some ways, I mean, one of the reasons I love, and I keep coming back to Nimbin and MardiGrass, is there is this kind of, we're just going to do it anyhow. We are just going to do it anyhow. And you can get so far with that, and MardiGrass shows you can get so far with that, and you can assert that right collectively once or twice a year. But if you were going to now go and say you're going to become the People's Republic of Nimbin, well, I think things would change a great deal and they'd come down on you with like a ton of bricks. I think there's a great place. There is a great place. Well, yeah, I think they are, but they're very successful at it and they've got a lot of power. So I think there's a great place for what Nimbin and MardiGrass does. Great place. But you're not going to get there by becoming the Independent Republic of Nimbin.
It's also better to ask for forgiveness than it is to ask for permission, at least in the Vancouver model. So that's, again, where civil disobedience, and again, I'm not imploring or advising anyone to break the law, but laws, let's look at the rights for women, the women vote, suffragettes. I mean, the women didn't wait around for, hey, maybe you'll give us the vote. They were quite aggressive with their protesting and advocacy for the vote. And I think a lot of the Canadian activism...
No. You can't add to that.
Anyway, but I think there's a lot of I've seen a lot of potential in Nimbin, and again, it's great to do this up in the hills, but I think you're going to need to take the message and what happens in the hills of Nimbin down to Canberra or down to your regional authorities and make your stand there.
Can I also just add one quick point to what Dave was saying, and I applauded it, that 3,000 people yesterday and only 30 coppers. Don't take a great deal of satisfaction out of that all the time, because 4,000 people on the steps of Parliament House in Victoria shouted out the names of suppressed names of 2 sex offenders, and they jailed one of them, me. So just they'll pick out one or two, and like the gentleman in the front there, yet you made up in the slammer.
Sure enough, they do that. And can I just say that the very next opportunity that we all have to exercise our rights and to assert a right to smoke cannabis is about 2 o'clock this afternoon at the rally. Be in it. Woo! Be in it. That's what we're here for. Look, we have more sessions to get to soon. We're running out a little bit of time. I don't know if there's any more hands being raised in the sort of...
Up the
There
back
is?
here.
Hello, hey.
Please
hi,
go
I'm
ahead,
also
sir.
from Canada, so I'm not
Oh,
really
good.
from here. So I was just wondering, in terms of like systems in the government for standing up for your rights, are there like, if you had like a pledge or you like asked for a referendum, has that been a conversation? Like, can you put forth a referendum and put it to the vote and have people like check off on the next election, like, hey, I want to legalize marijuana?
Short answer, there's no citizen-initiated referenda in Australia. That's right, in some other countries, not here. Sadly, maybe.
If you want to get a referendum to voters, and we normally have them that coincide with state or federal elections or local council elections, you have to get either the local council or the state parliament or the federal parliament to first of all pass some legislation or pass a motion to allow for a referendum. But you know what? There'll be a bunch of local council elections happening all around New South Wales in September of this year. Maybe you should see, if your council's going to election, maybe you should ask your local council if they'll put up a referendum about legalising cannabis. That'd be a useful thing to do.
Maybe.
I was just going to say too that in my experience with observing in Canada and the US these Bill of Rights or Charters of Rights, is it definitely gives people buoyancy and some kind of sense of positive manoeuvre to make change. So, for example, in Colorado, people would go, oh, you know, all this cannabis stuff is great. And they go, of course, it's our constitutional right. So it's like, it's almost like some sense of, indeed, people authority. Though, of course, the other edge of the wedge is in the US, the federal government will quite happily ignore the Constitution. So at the moment, there's still all the states that have passed recreational cannabis that are jumping in and trying to work out how they deal with possibly a very hostile federal government. Okay. Like, for example, Colorado has decided that it's granted all of its recreational dispensaries and growers, they're all medical as well now. Yeah.
Fair enough. Any other comments, questions, observations from...
That point you were making about California and other states, I mean, I've forgotten the word for it, but at every state election you'll see they'll have referendum number 7 or number 8 or number 9, what are they called? Yeah, proposition. So you go to a state government, you're electing a governor and the legislature, but you're also voting on 4, 5 or 6 very important issues as well as propositions.
Yeah, the ballot papers there are immensely complex and really quite full on. However, like for instance, in the presidential election in California, or my friend in San Francisco, he had about, honestly, it was 26 different things to vote when he went to the polling booth. However, he could just decide to vote for one thing. As in, he could just go, I'll just go do the president. But there was heaps of other stuff you could be voting on. So people do choose whether they vote for all or some or none.
Do I get to speak?
Yeah, one question here.
Yeah, one of my main concerns in New South Wales particularly is that the guy from Canada had a good question about citizen-initiated referendums, is that in New South Wales we're increasingly seeing legislation being shaped by powerful lobby groups. I guess one that comes to mind is the Police Association of New South Wales. This is a very powerful organisation, paramilitary, that has endless amounts of taxpayers' dollars at its disposal. And I just want to give you an example. Like in Lismore recently, I heard that at Lismore City Council there was a job going for a whippersnipper operator. 160 people applied for that job. And in the meantime, someone like the New South Wales Police could be lobbying for a much better employment situation within not just this region, but the whole state. But instead, what do they lobby for? Stricter laws so they can have more choppers and more Glock pistols, etc., etc. And it seems increasingly like they are just a cartel. That, so I'm interested... I sort of think that the way that legislation is enacted, particularly in New South Wales, is it's getting further and further away from what citizens actually want, you know. And I'm curious to know whether any kind of Charter of Rights or Bill of Rights could sort of bring us closer to having citizen-initiated referendums, because really laws affect the majority of the population more than they do than the minority. So the majority should really have a say in those laws that are going to affect them, especially if they take away your liberty. We have a member of our community here who's serving 2 years jail because he was caught, he was a manicurer. For anyone who doesn't know that, people pay people to trim cannabis. He was getting paid $200 a pound, which is nothing. And now he is serving 2.5 years prison. He doesn't have any other criminal convictions except a couple of drink driving charges. It's costing him it's costing the state over $100,000 to keep him in prison each year. How does that serve our community? It does not. So my question to you guys is, can we get a bit more power for the majority of citizens? You know.
Well, citizens-initiated referendums are a good idea. Quite a number of countries have them. The one country that I regard as a good model to look to for as an example would be Switzerland. They have them, and they're regularly quite controversial. They had one on whether abolishing mosques or something like that recently. They've had them on all sorts of things. What they require is a substantial number of signatories to the petition for the referendum, and then it kicks off. There is an argument for saying referendums should only have a negative effect, So in other words, they should be able to overturn a bill that's passed through the Parliament. So it's sort of like a third level of review. So the two houses of Parliament and then the negative aspect. But some countries do have a positive aspect. So if it passes, it can be a positive initiative, and then the Parliament is obliged to introduce it into legislation. I think they are a good idea, but realistically, we have to be realistic about Australian politics. How do things change? You really do have to have a good look at what influence you can bring to bear on the political process. And look at the marijuana situation. It wasn't until there were people who were sick, who were not receiving the treatment that they could have received because medical marijuana was prohibited. It got picked up in the mainstream media. I imagine many of you don't like Alan Jones, and yet he was an absolute champion of medical marijuana. And it was only when that happened that it became mainstream issue, and the politicians started saying, yes, okay, we'll approve it. And even now, it is not really available, as I'm sure you know better than I do. Even now, there is still nobody licensed to grow it locally. There's some movement on importing it, but producing it locally. And as for recreational, I mean, for a long time, I've been the only politician in the federal parliament saying recreational should be approved too. We've got it in 8 American states. It's been legal in Amsterdam for God knows how long. I don't know, Derryn may have said something about it in the Senate as well more recently. But for quite a while, I was the only one there saying anything about recreational use. And yet, if we had recreational use, we wouldn't have all these barriers to medical marijuana. I mean, it's being regulated to death. Now, so we made progress on medical, kind of. We're making no progress on recreational. Why? Because you guys all talk to each other, and not enough noise is made outside of Nimbin. Not enough noise is made in Canberra, in Sydney, where David is, in Melbourne, in the state parliaments. I actually think the state parliaments are a better chance of getting marijuana legalised than it is in Canberra. Australia's signed up to all these international treaties and basically prohibit Australia from approving marijuana. It's the same situation as America. The states are where the walls are starting to crumble. The federal government in the United States says, no, we can't do that. So it's falling down at the state level, to the state level. I think the same thing will happen here, but it's not going to happen by itself. And it won't happen by you guys wearing colourful clothing and defying the coppers to catch you. That's not going to change the law. It is not going to change the law, I'm sorry, but you really are going to have to get political.
Going back to that citizens referenda, the major parties will say to you that they oppose citizens referendums, if you like, because you elect politicians and elect parties to govern the state and federally, and if you don't like it, then vote them out next time, vote somebody in who supports the cause that you are pushing with your referendum. So I think with the major parties, you'll get nowhere.
Yeah. Citizens-initiated referendum are great for democracy in the broad. You have to be careful that they don't oppress a minority because they can have that effect. A majority can just single out a minority and really have a go at them in a citizen-initiated referendum, and that's the complicated politics on citizens-initiated referendum. You were asking, though, about New South Wales and the power of the Police Association. And for those of you who don't know it, the Police Association is the body that represents pretty much 99% of police in New South Wales. You have similar organisations in Canada and the US.
Those organisations have definitely tried to cash in on legalisation too. So,
in the New South Wales Parliament, I sit there and observe law after law after law after law that goes through, normally agreed to by both the Coalition and Labor, which just gives more and more power to the police. You know, increased power over consorting laws, expanded use of drug dogs, authorising the roadside drug testing, pushing increased discretionary powers that are mainly used against Aboriginal people, I mean, just law after law after law goes through, normally cheered through by both the Coalition and Labor. And the key voice that you'll hear time and time again being referred to by both those political parties is the New South Wales Police Association and whoever the Commissioner of Police is at a time. And there's a very unhealthy political environment in the New South Wales Parliament that is whatever the police ask for, they get. And often, I'll be honest, there's often only myself normally and on behalf of the Greens who have the only dissident voice to stand up against consorting laws and increased police powers and the like. It's a very unhealthy culture, and it's something I'm glad you're exposing, because along with coal miners and big pharmaceutical companies, the Police Association has a huge and unhealthy amount of influence in New South Wales politics.
We're short of time. I think we've got time for one more question.
Carmen, what's your question?
Wait till I come.
Wait for the microphone. Won't be far away.
Do you think the political slow pace has to do with Lucy Turnbull's role in the pharmaceutical industry?
Repeat that question, Carmen. Sorry, I didn't hear you.
The Prime Minister's wife, she's heavily involved in the pharmaceutical industry. Maybe that might have something to do with the slow pace of...
No.
No?
No, and I'm being emphatic for a reason, because I'm not sure, I don't want to accuse you of anything, but conspiracy theories honestly do not work in favour of making progress. The pharmaceutical industry is global. Australia is a tiny part of the global market. It really is insignificant in global terms. I used to work in the animal health pharmaceutical market. I know it pretty well. And the idea that any decisions of any material consequence are made in Australia is over-egging it substantially. Australia is an afterthought in the global pharmaceutical market.
And if you think it's a conspiracy, I mean, in the Senate only a few months ago, I managed to get referred to a Senate committee, an issue which I believe is the biggest medical issue for women in this country since the thalidomide scandal of the 50s and 60s, and that is called transvaginal mesh. A court case is coming up in a couple of months' time, which we are pushing hard for. I believe the 100,000 women in Australia for prolapse and incontinence have been implanted with this plastic propylene inserts. It's crippling women. I think probably it's affecting putting some women in wheelchairs, 10,000 women. Now, we're going after, you talk about the big drug conspiracy, the only reason I mention it today is because we're going after Johnson & Johnson, and we've got 107,000 women now in America who have joined a joint court action against them, and in Scotland there's been an inquiry, in England Britain is now being an inquiry, and here, just watch it the next couple of months. The mainstream media didn't touch it for months because it had the word vagina in it, and when I put the bill up to the notice of motion, I was asked by another senator, female, suggested that I call it pelvic mesh rather than transvaginal mesh because it had more chance of getting through. And I thought, what the hell have we come to? Thank you.
But yeah, your point is its interest in money. Yeah, money is the driving force. Always say, look who benefits.
Lucy Turnbull does have a noxious role in New South Wales politics. I don't necessarily think it's her role as representing pharmaceuticals. She's in charge of the Greater Sydney Commission Planning Authority, and she basically is making the decisions about which part of Sydney will be bulldozed for development and which parts won't. She's unelected, deeply noxious role, but that's where I'd complain about her. And look, Derryn and I don't agree on everything. I think that'd be pretty fair to say.
Fair.
But if you Google Joanne McCarthy and you Google the story that who's a fabulous journalist from the Newcastle Herald, and you look at the work that she did on that, it would actually chill you. And I'm glad that Derryn's doing the work he's doing in the Senate on it. We absolutely need to shine light on it.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. We do have more fun to have at MardiGrass. We have more work to do, political work to do. That is to participate in law reform, my friends. Well, thank you for participating in this session. In a few minutes, David Shoebridge and I are going to have a session on interacting with police, a bit of a workshop. So those that want to hang around, please do. If all of you want to hang around, that's great. We'll do that in about 5 minutes or thereabouts. The rally, March and rally at 2 o'clock this afternoon, be in it. Hang around for the rally as well for a few speeches, one or two, but the rally and the march is the centrepiece, the reason we are here. So please take part in that. In the meantime, I will thank once again David Shoebridge, New South Wales Greens, David Leyonhjelm from the Senator Leyonhjelm, the Liberal Democrats, Rob Laurie, our visitor from Canada, a lawyer, and Senator Derryn Hinch. Thank you one and all, and thank you for everyone for participating today.